Hello and welcome to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism Global Journalism Seminar Series. We're in the second week of the COP26 summit in Glasgow, and it seems very apt and very appropriate to be speaking today with our speaker, Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson, a climate journalist from Samoa. She's both a climate expert, but also a good friend. And an old friend. Lagipoiva Cherelle was a fellow here at the Reuters Institute and way ahead of the curve. In 2010, she wrote a piece of work for us called Staying Afloat in Paradise, reporting climate change in the Pacific, at a time that we were only just beginning to understand both how important climate journalism was in this area and also the dearth of it, and how hard it was at the time and still can be to convince newsrooms that this was a topic worth considering. Since her fellowship with us, she's gone on to found the Pacific Environment Weekly, a publication aimed at increasing coverage of environmental issues across her region, and is also a regular contributor to The Guardian, The Economist, and many other publications. Cherelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mira, for having me. Salafalava, everyone.
Thank you. Welcome. Now you have a presentation, so I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and then we'll be back for questions and general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. I'll share this screen now and we'll go from there. And hopefully today technology will cooperate with us. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Perfect. So good afternoon, good morning. It's great to be here. Once again, thank you, Mira, for having me and Caitlin for organizing. It's always a pleasure to return to my roots at the Institute. I wish I was there, although it is always freezing when I'm there. So I'm glad we're doing this virtually as well. A little bit about me, just to start. I realized with some dismay that it's been 10 years, 11 years since my time at Reuters. So I always have to reintroduce myself when I do these talks. So I'm originally from Samoa, which is an island in Samoa. It's the bigger island. I was motivated to do the work that I do on environmental journalism because of where I come from, of the island I'm from, which is Samoa, and also the people and the family that I represent. And a key part of that family is the lady here with the 3 red flowers, who is my mom, High Chief Basilifiti Molangi Jackson. She founded the first Indigenous Conservation Society in Samoa, and one of the first ones in the Pacific. So under her leadership, rather, and her, being brought up by a strong conservation leader, you kind of didn't really have a choice but to also work in the field and promote the value of environments to Indigenous communities. So in 2009, I founded the Pacific Environment Weekly. 2010, I did the research on Staying Afloat in Paradise. And I think Mira's done a great job introducing, so I don't need to go further into that. But I wanted to highlight the outline of my presentation. So first, I'll be highlighting the stages of reporting on climate change as I see it from the global narratives of Pacific Islands. Second, highlights of some of the COP26 coverage that I've seen so far. Third, my personal experience in covering climate from a Pacific Islander perspective. And then I'll briefly touch on Pacific representation in media research and in climate journalism initiatives, and then touch on tips for coverage. It sounds long, but it's not that long. I'm looking forward to kind of discussing with you some of the issues that will come out of this. So here's my theory and how I perceived how climate has been covered by global media in respect to small island states or Pacific Islands in this case. I feel like in the past 20 years, this is how it's evolved. One, the first stage being that global North media paid very little attention to climate change is a news story in respect to Pacific Islands, and Pacific Islands were not really a factor when it came to climate change reporting. Second, it was when they did start covering issues related to climate, it was a very much a Western perspective. Global North media recognized the problem and started covering it from a Western perspective, using the ice caps and polar bears and things that in the Pacific Islands we couldn't really connect with. We didn't see ourselves as part of that problem. Then you had what we're deep inside now, which is doom and gloom reporting. So Global North media realized that, that there are islands who are part of the world who are facing the direct impacts of climate change. And then there is this influx of over-reporting on the doom and gloom aspects, but with a twist on Western lenses. And I'll expand on this as we go. Then the future, and it's also now, I perceive, is the focus on less on doom and gloom, but more on in-depth investigation of high-emitting countries, more like a solutions-oriented approach to climate journalism. So that's happening now in some areas, but it's rarely an in-depth treatment of Pacific Island issues. So just a snapshot. I know that Mira's just returned from COP26, and I really want to have a great conversation with her on that to see what her reflections are, because it's a whole other beast in itself when you cover it as a climate journalist. So just some initial reflections on the coverage so far. If you just do a Google search on COP26 and Pacific Islands, the most prominent news item that you'll see is the Tuvalu minister speaking, doing his presentation to a side event at COP26 from the ocean. Quite an extraordinary achievement by them in that, it was a very compelling imagery. They captured it really well and used social media to push out the messaging and highlight the work that he did there in presenting from the ocean. Then you also have some issues, the usual vanishing islands approach, disappearing islands, and then representation of Pacific Islands in COP26. Then if you look at how Pacific media covered COP26, you'll see smiling faces. Everyone's happy and doing the 1.5, which is a campaign run by one of the regional environmental bodies in the Pacific. And it's really more nationally focused on what Pacific Islands are doing at the COP. So, for example, Ngalumalumana Annie Rasmussen has just been re-elected to the COP Bureau, a big deal. There's only 11 members of the COP Bureau, and one of them is Samoan, and she's the SIDS representative. So that's actually a huge deal that wasn't really covered by global media because it's not anyone thinking or wearing a grass skirt. So, so here's the differences that I saw. Global media tended to, and this is a classic approach. Global media tend to focus on Pacific Islands as a kind of quaint region when it comes to climate change coverage. There's references to tiny countries, to disappearing islands. It's almost an amusing subject matter or a region to include in a climate story. Continuously a focus on grief, on doom and gloom as well. And there's also broad generalizations on the impacts of climate change in the Pacific Islands. As we all know, in the Pacific Islands, there's varying degrees of impact depending on the type of islands. You have the atoll nations, which, sea level rise is a big deal, and there is imminent threat on the existence of those islands. And then you have volcanic islands such as Samoa, where the impacts differ greatly to atoll nations. And then if you look at the way that Pacific Island media covered it, really focus on national approaches. National approaches being, what is the Minister of Climate Change or the Minister of Foreign Affairs doing? What are the interventions that the small island states are making? There's happy faces, like I pointed out. There's empowering language. You'll see that when Pacific Island youth advocates were, appeared in plenary or were in protests, that they highlighted the resilience of Pacific people and also the voice of youth, but it was really empowering language. So you'll see in Pacific media that when we cover ourselves and Pacific Islands, we treat the Pacific like any other country, not as quaint little countries in the Pacific Ocean. And then, there's also like specific focus on the topics of interest in the different Pacific Islands. So my personal experience in covering climate change as a Pacific Island journalist has been very, very interesting. Interesting in that throughout my experience, I feel like I constantly have to push the fact that we are not tiny, that the issues that we face are legitimate and should be globally recognized and not just, a one-off story for one particular beat occasionally. And it's very discouraging, but it's also very encouraging in that every time I have to argue for a specific coverage or a specific word to be used, I know that my role in that particular news organization at that time is important, and I'll reflect on that as we go. So some of my most recent coverage is the Pacific Islands declaring our baselines, fixing baselines of the Pacific Islands so that when islands shrink, the maritime entitlements of the Pacific don't shrink with it. Then some of the coverage on the IPCC reports and implications on Pacific Islands. And then most recently, that's a really exciting project on an impossible choice. And it's a podcast and article series by The Guardian. This was initiated by the Pacific editor, Kate Lyons in Australia, but this appeared in print in London 2 weeks before COP26. And the idea there was really to highlight the true impact of climate change on the existence of atoll nations. We spoke to something like 30 people on these islands, on Tuvalu, on Carteret Islands, and people who migrated as a result of climate change. We spoke to experts and ambassadors who are negotiating on behalf of the Pacific. So it really brought together kind of like this holistic narrative of the impacts of climate change on the people of the Pacific. So if you have time, go listen to this podcast series because you'll hear the voices of the Pacific about the impact on them and when we noticed climate change in our history and in our communities. So the podcast involved a team of 8 people working across London, Sydney, Melbourne, and then we had correspondents out on the islands in Tuvalu, in Papua New Guinea, and in a few other places. And so, we worked over a few months trying to track people down, trying to make sure that we get all of the voices that we needed for the podcast. It was the first time I worked on a podcast on climate change, and it was a really interesting experience. And these are some of the things I came away with, which I think is really important when we speak about covering climate change. And I think for some context, when I did my study in 2010 at Reuters Institute, I did look at how UK media was covering Pacific Islands. So to then, 11 years later, work on a project with The Guardian on Pacific Islands was a big, big deal. It's a huge honor for me to do this, but also spoke to the changing nature of mainstream journalism and how, you know, the Pacific is becoming this area where mainstream media is regarding. So these are some of the reflections that I have on that particular experience. One, representation matters when it comes to covering climate. In the production team that we had, it was all Australians. Yet the story was on the Pacific. So I was grateful to be part of the production team because that means I could, you know, insert the nuances in the Pacific that was definitely necessary for a project like this. All throughout the project, I constantly had to assert empowering language because it comes naturally in the coverage of specific issues. So the number of tiny references I had to delete in the script was quite extraordinary. And this is no judgment, you know, on my colleagues, my amazing colleagues at The Guardian who I worked with. I just think some things, you know, are just second nature and you can't really avoid it. Another thing I found really interesting, which again speaks to the need for that representation. Like, if you're going to report on the Pacific, have a Pacific Islander as part of your team, collaborate with the Pacific journalists. There was a reference to a paramount chief on one of the islands that one of our journalists went to. And so when the interview came back to production, my Australian colleague wrote this part of the script that said, you know, name of the chief said, let's say Tom, Tom Sassy, a paramount chief there. Like it was a very innocent kind of scripting. And so I changed there to the name of the village, the island, and the country. And she queried, she said, why, you know, that's longer, you know, why would you change it like that when we've just said the paramount chief? And I'm like, would you say the queen there? You know, and that's something, like she stepped back and she goes, yeah, that makes sense. I wouldn't say the Queen Elizabeth there, or she's the queen there. You would actually reference the country. And so, you know, those, I know it's a small reference, but it's still a really important one. Then the other thing I came across in that project is balancing grief, reality, and still not be too disempowering in the language that we use. That was a really kind of fine line to walk on in producing that series. And then the other one is the target audience challenge. So The Guardian made it clear that we were targeting and the audience was the UK, Australia, global north. So it was a challenge for me in that some of the things and the issues that I took for granted that I know that Pacific Islanders would understand had to be explained in a way that a Londoner would understand. And then the final one is, you know, being the story while reporting on the story. When it comes to climate change, as a Pacific Islander, you are part of the story. And so that's always been an interesting line to kind of tread carefully so that it doesn't become too much about self, but it becomes about the islands that we report on. So I wanted to touch briefly on this because of the important work that the Institute is doing in bringing together all of your perspectives, the global fellows, and the amazing research that takes place at the Institute. There still continues to be a limited number of Pacific journalists involved in climate journalism research. When climate journalism research is conducted about Pacific Islands, Pacific journalists are not invited to participate generally, or Pacific experts. Climate change journalism research, so done by Australian and British academics, tend to be condescending and make broad generalizations not founded on realities on the ground. So a good example is about a few years ago, Monash University in Australia did a study noting that Pacific journalists rely on politicians and not scientists for climate stories. So this was really a flawed finding, because most of the scientists in the Pacific actually work for government. So they are scientists, but sometimes they're politicians. And also it insinuated that Pacific journalists had a choice, because often on the islands we're from, we actually don't have climate scientists. So to have a finding like that, not informed by the realities of the numbers and the situation on the ground, is the exact reason why it should be, these types of research should also involve journalists from those countries. There was a 2020 study by Oxford University on Pacific Island coverage of climate change, which claimed to be the first study of its type, which I found actually fascinating. I didn't know about it. I was actually tagged on Twitter by a few people from the UK and a few researchers from the Caribbean saying, "Didn't you do the first study in 2010 on this issue?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I did, but obviously I'm not from the UK, so maybe it didn't count." So, and of course I'm being sarcastic here, but, that's a challenge that I'm sure a lot of us have, coming from developing countries, doing genuinely good research on our own industry and not being recognized because, we didn't affiliate it with a well-known researcher or a well-known journalist. So I wanted to touch on that because it's valid. And then you have representation in climate journalism initiatives. I'm sure you've heard of Covering Climate Now, Media and Climate Change Observatory out in the US, and Currently, which is the meteorology and climate news service. And then, of course, the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. Just some initial reflections here. The Oxford one is actually the only one that has a woman to a brown person as part of its leadership. And you can see her on the screen. And it was really important for me to have this slide here because for the three initiatives at the top here, it's all led by white men. I think all of them are Americans. And so the perspective is always slanted to the West. It's always slanted to the global North. So it's really important, not just for the Pacific, but for developing country journalists to also have a space within climate journalism initiatives so that our perspectives continue to be taken into account when issues related to the challenges of reporting on climate are considered. So I'm really grateful to the Institute and Mira for initiating the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, because it is actually one of the first networks of its type that's truly inclusive in nature and from a credible and well-respected institute. So I'm really excited to be a part of it and looking forward to more to come from the network. So some final tips overall, just as a reflection on all of these issues that I brought up, is one, if you're going to do work on climate journalism, if you're going to research or do stories about the Pacific, involve Pacific journalists. There's so many Pacific journalists who would love to help you out. You can find them online through social media. There's really no excuse anymore not to branch out. To steer clear of the disempowering language, so words such as tiny, disappearing, vanishing, all of those, not necessary. You can still use good language, typical language that you would use anywhere else. So a good go-to would be, would I say this about a country occupied by white people? Would I say this about a continent? And if the answer is no, then don't say it. Then find alternative language. 3, understand the nuances. If the nuances, and this is something I always find very interesting about Western journalists, is their confidence to go into a place of strong cultural history and reporting on it like just any other place. When there is so much richness in language and culture that it could inform a story better. So I would highly recommend those who do cover climate in the Pacific to really understand the nuances of politics when it comes to climate change in the Pacific. 4th, we don't look at climate change the same way that Western journalists do. We actually we always find Pacific Islanders find humor in a lot of situations. So like we could be suffering from a cyclone and we'll still find a way to laugh about it. And I know that's not the narrative that the New York Times would want to appear on their front pages, because it doesn't add up to the grief aspect of climate change. So, but we do, when we cover and when we talk about climate change in our circles, it is fun. There's some stuff that's quite funny. Could be diplomatically incorrect in many circles. And then the last one is, let Pacific Islanders tell their story straight from the source. It doesn't have to be an expert sitting in Germany that could tell the story of the Pacific, because there are people in the Pacific that could tell their own stories. And this is the last one I'm going to leave up here for a minute. This is up and coming climate journalist in Samoa. His name is Mark. And these are some of his stories. I messaged him and I said, I'm going to feature you at Oxford. So this is one of the greatest moments in Samoan climate journalism. So I just wanted to plug my young colleague here who's decided to take up climate journalism because he feels it's an important thing for the Pacific and for Samoa, and we want to encourage that. And yes, Mira, he will be a member of the network. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cherelle. Thank you. That was utterly brilliant. And yes, the quick plug for the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. Thank you so much for mentioning it. And we are taking applications from all journalists, I want to say, and not just climate journalists, but health, politics, transport, sport, whatever beat you cover. Do look. It's a kind of free to join network. We do want journalists from around the world. So please do join. The deadline is Monday. On your talk, it was brilliant. So thank you. You covered absolutely everything I hope you'd cover. And I've written, "We are not tiny" in big capital letters across my notebook, because that's a very short woman from a very small island myself, 2 small islands, Sri Lanka and the United Kingdom. I completely empathize. And on a side note about diversity, I was at the COP summit, as you rightly pointed out, and we held an event on Friday night, and it was very striking. There was tables and stools that we were meant to perch on. And I thought, I can't perch on the stools. I have to climb up, and then my legs are swinging. So if you look at the photos, my co-founder, Wolfgang Blau, who's very tall in German, is sitting at ease against a stool, and I'm stood there because I can't get up onto the stool. So if you have an international summit, assume that most people aren't 6 foot tall.
Oh, that's hilarious. Sorry, I totally empathize.
One thing I did want to, we got lots of questions from our journalist fellows in the seminar room and also from the audience online. But one thing I wanted to start with was, at the beginning, you raised the story of your incredible mother, who was so active in this field so long ago. Could you talk a little bit about where you see the issue of gender and climate change? Because we had a day of gender at COP26, and it focused on 2 things. It focused on this idea of women as natural custodians of the earth and having a different approach, and then a kind of more feminist approach which is saying essentially the patriarchy is destroying the planet and that's what we need to change. And I'd be very interested to know what your perspective on these 2 things are.
Yeah, it's it's gender and climate is an area that really needs more attention from the media. I think it's something that really requires more work also from developing country media. So I co-founded Women in Climate Change in Samoa, which really brought together, so as a climate journalist, I did that, but brought together politicians, private sector, IGO workers, so across the board. And what I found was I didn't need to look for women. I just needed to invite the heads of these specific things, and they just happen to be women. And that's a telling, statistic, because women are leading in climate change. Women are leading in negotiations. Women are leading in the science, in policy making, in community and grassroots. So capturing that in respect to the work on climate change is really important. And, I learned this from my mom, and this is back in the 80s. This woman founded the Indigenous Conservation Society, and that is common throughout developing countries. And so it's just a matter of capturing it. Under UNFCCC, when the Gender Action Plan was approved under the Fiji COP, which was in Bonn, I think this was 2017, that was a game changer in terms of integrating gender into the work of UNFCCC, but also how countries report on their work in integrating gender into adaptation and mitigation on the ground. So I think it's really important work, and I'd love to see more research on it.
Thank you. And one more question from me before I'll jump to the audience. You mentioned the grass skirts issue, the idea of the fact that colleagues who are doing important work on the UNFCCC and elsewhere are not getting the attention, the profiles, because not in grass skirts. Again, at COP, there was some focus on Indigenous communities and land right defenders, especially crucially on Saturday at the kind of climate protests that happened outside the venue. And it did strike me that the approach was very much to come in traditional dress and speak on the platform in traditional dress. And it made perfect sense in many ways because it's very visual and it grabs people's attention, and it also very clearly identifies who you are and why you are there. On the other hand, it plays into a certain othering where everyone from everywhere else in the world is in basically jeans and heavy sweaters against the Scottish rain, and and a small group of people have to be in their traditional outfits, which aren't, to be being blunt, cut out for the Glaswegian weather in November to kind of make their point.
There's a fine line, right? And usually in advocacy outside of the COPs, you will find Indigenous representatives and advocates come in traditional wear. And I think that is the space. It is their right, our right, to come in our own traditional wear, no matter where, whether it be the blistering winds of Copenhagen, they'll still appear, will come in skirts and flowers and what have you. But I think what I was referencing was, how do Western journalists then frame the narrative on Pacific Islanders? And it really needs to go away from that approach of, okay, they're quaint, cute women in grass skirts that's going to disappear. So that really needs to change. But what I really, that you mentioned this, and I think it's a really, really important point, the involvement of Indigenous communities in the COP. It's actually not, Indigenous communities are not well represented, nor are they well integrated into the COP. The UNFCCC, the COP did pass Indigenous representation, that delegations had to have an Indigenous representative as part of their delegation. You don't really see them in the room, but you see them on the side events. So is that true representation, or is it just merely, rubber stamping and making it look like that? And I've been in COPs where someone walks in, a chief walks in full regalia, and they look out of place, like you said. But I think it's sad that our Indigenous communities are seen as the other when they do walk into global spaces. just another anecdote on this. A few Pacific Island negotiators intentionally wear suits to blend so that they are not perceived as the others. So it's something that we realize ourselves. So I don't wear a flower. I don't make myself look any different when I go into negotiations, because there is a certain stereotype that comes with it, which when you want to do the work, you don't really want that to impact the work. Otherwise, you're having to fight that narrative while still trying to do the work. So it's entrenched. The marginalization of indigenous communities is entrenched in the UNFCCC, and it's something that definitely needs to change.
And it also just highlights how many more layers of complexity certain people have to go through before they're even seen, never mind given a space at the table.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to some of the journalist fellows' questions now, and in particular, one from Claudia from Guatemala about audience prioritization. So you talked about the podcast with The Guardian and who are the target audiences. So how do you really do this? How do you manage audience prioritization? And do you have a single audience focus that you try to maintain, or do you do it on a case-by-case basis?
So for me, I don't really have a choice. I just go with what the editors say, and we all know that The Guardian really targets the British audience and the global North audience. So it's just a matter of balancing. So there's some issues that I don't really want to dumb down too much. I don't really want to use that term, but so to have to explain concepts that Pacific Islanders understand very well, that was an additional challenge with some of the things that we took for granted. I then had to kind of explain a bit deeper, because I knew that I was speaking to, this was aimed at someone who would not really know. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And the kind of second question from Claudia is about political pressures, because climate reporting is very polarized in many parts of the world, and you spent a lot of time in the US where it's very, very incredibly polarized. Have you felt any kind of pressure when reporting on climate, and have you basically clashed with anyone's political interests?
Oh yes, many. But just on the home front, we've had, I've had ministers in the past call up my editors-in-chief and publishers, to discourage me from reporting on the impacts of climate change because it made our country look bad. So really, it's fortunately for us in the Pacific, not such a contentious issue. We don't really have climate deniers, and it's not so much a political issue as it is a lived reality issue. So that's something I don't really have to deal with. But knowing and seeing the political pressures that Western journalists have to face, especially in the US, has been quite fascinating that it's such a political issue for them to cover. So for myself, I've had a lot of pressure internally to try and minimize the impact aspect of the climate crisis on islands, but otherwise it's been fairly a safe area to cover.
That in itself is really interesting and worth looking into more deeply. Well, talk to you about that. A question from Meraj, who's done a lot of reporting from Kashmir and talked about India, and journalist at News Laundry. Could you give some examples of some of the empowering language in the Pacific Islands that you would like to see used, as opposed to disempowering language that you've given some examples of?
Sure. So the use of the word resilience is something that really needs to be highlighted. So like building the resilience, there's this classic narrative that Pacific climate warriors are using, which is we are fighting, not drowning. So avoiding the uses of words such as drowning and sinking. So rising, so resilience, rising. And I think the issue is not so much using empowering language as it is just stating the issue as it is. So instead of disappearing, it is an existential crisis. Instead of drowning, it is sea level rise. So just stating the issue as fact and not in the lenses where there is the victim who are Pacific Islanders.
Yeah. And question from Klaus, an Austrian fellow who has been covered COP for a long time, and he's been to COP 21, 22, and 23. How would you explain the mainstream media's focus on climate change in the last 2 years from your perspective? And I'm interested in this as well, because I've seen lots of different viewpoints of what COP has become about, and I'd be really interested to know how you see it, and especially the role of activists, partly Greta Thunberg, but also young activists elsewhere. And we have a lot of research at the Reuters Institute that shows that a lot of people's climate change consumption amongst younger people is driven by influencers and celebrities and activists. And so from your perspective, as both kind of an insider and an outsider to this world, what do you see?
Well, the last year of Trump presidency was very interesting in terms of climate coverage because of the denialism aspect. From my viewpoint of the coverage of climate change in the past 2 years, it's definitely needed that celebrity to attract coverage. And it needed a white celebrity too. So there have been a lot of young advocates from the Pacific, from Africa region, from Asia region, who've been advocating for the rights of indigenous communities in climate crisis. But it's never really received the same level of coverage that Greta has. Now, and this is not to discredit, because I think the role that Greta has played in climate coverage in the past 2 years has been extraordinary. This girl has single-handedly raised the profile of climate change as a news topic in so many communities. Even in the Pacific community, she is, known. Everyone knows her name, and I think the fact that she's European and used part of the privilege to raise the profile of the issue was really important. And the great thing about her work is that she really credits Indigenous advocates in her work as well. It's not about her, it's about the issue itself. So I've seen the coverage in the past 2 years has really been focused on the role of high emitting countries, corporate responsibility. And I've really enjoyed that part of the coverage. But I really feel like the missing piece here is what is ahead in terms of negotiation, realistically, who is blocking negotiations, and will anything come out of the COPs moving forward? I really feel there should be better and more in-depth analysis of those issues. There are some, and the economists have done some really amazing work on that, but there definitely should be more.
Who is blocking the negotiations?
We're having a journalism talk, right?
Yes. I'm just curious.
From the Pacific region, Australia is one of these kind of like, how you have that uncle who comes to the party and says that, they love you, but actually turns around and does really atrocious things to you as a family member. That's Australia. So in terms of blockage in the Pacific region, Australia is a key part of that. They are responsible for extraordinary amounts of emissions compared to the Pacific Islands put together, and they refuse to own up to it and to actually deliver on what they promise.
Okay, thank you. Going back to journalism, a question from Ali Hingoro in Pakistan about digital media platforms. Again, the research we've shown kind of in the digital news report shows that television is by far the most important vehicle globally for how people still receive climate change news, and then the digital space and print is relatively unimportant. What is most important for you? Which platforms do you use the most? And again, in Samoa and in the communities you work with, where do they get most of their news from?
So in Samoa, if you want to So newsprint is still very popular, newspapers. And that combined with online media. So a lot of the news is received through social media. So newspapers and TV and radio use social media to push the content. TV is still the most popular, so I agree. TV, radio, and then newspapers. But in terms of like influence, newspapers still tend to be the medium that has the most influence. So I personally use online media because that's easier and that's the way of the world. I don't really like television because then I have to look pretty while speaking and thinking at the same time.
You always
and who has
do.
the time for that? I really enjoyed the podcasting space, and that's something that's really growing. Some of the reason why we don't get a lot of coverage in the Pacific on TV is due to the low bandwidth. It's really hard to kind of send good footage across. So that's some of the challenges we have in ensuring that we have good footage of the Pacific when climate change is covered on TV.
Gotcha. Thank you. Can I ask a bit more about podcasting? So we have Kippi from Finland who's doing her entire project on podcasting. And what were the goals and how did what do you think the listeners gained from listening to it? And also, how's it doing? Do you have a sense of numbers and reach and engagement?
Yes, so I don't have the numbers, but it's doing really, really well. I've had, like right now on average, since we aired it, is air the word for a podcast? Since we've released it, I've been receiving messages from people all over the world on social media and on emails reaching out to tell their story, but also to share their reflections of how they thought of the podcast series. So it's been well received. The Guardian our team at The Guardian are really impressed by how it's been received. The numbers are good. That's what I've been told. The numbers are good. It's been a great experience. And I think as a medium to tell more in-depth stories of climate change, I think it's an excellent way to do it. I've received a lot of good feedback in the US because apparently podcasting is a big thing in the US. I didn't really know that, but it's a lot more intimate. So the stories can be told in a lot more personal manner. So those are my reflections. Overall, it went really well.
Thank you. We'll look out for it more as well and see how it develops over time, and especially if there's an uptick after the kind of.
Yes, definitely.
You touched on this just now on impact, and this question from Gideon Sarpong in Ghana. Well, he said he's in the seminar room, but he's a journalist from Ghana. Do you have specific examples of how some of your work has resulted in direct action from governments? And do you seek that? Do you seek kind of policy change? What do you define as impact in your reporting and your work?
Policy change. Policy change is a key one. I've definitely seen shifts in approaches to being transparent about the work that government is doing on climate change. That's certainly something that I've seen the impact of my work. Some of my broader environmental journalism work has received really good reviews and also accepted by governments in the Pacific in terms of like the development and how they move forward on environmental development. One of the stories I did back in 2007 on tourism development that was done in an area that was quite prone to storm surges and sea level rise. That story itself led to actually the burning down of my office. But it also led to more awareness of environmental impact assessments. So EIAs are now publicly available and more accessible to journalists to access. Because it took me 5 years to get my hands on the EIA for that particular project. It's the tourist, sorry?
You can't mention the burning down of your office without explaining more.
So I did this in three-part investigation on a tourism development that involved was a multi-million-dollar tourism development. And the EIA and the social impact assessment clearly outlined that it would be it's a flood zone. And that the man-made island that they created it would actually harm the communities around it in cyclone season. And there were quite a lot of politicians and very wealthy people involved in the project itself. And so I ran the two parts, and then the night before the third part was supposed to be published, which included some names. My office burned down. The newspaper that I worked for at the time that I was editing for was actually burnt to the ground. So I never did get to publish because my laptop was in the building when it burned down. But that's the reality of reporting on environment in the Pacific. In Fiji, there's been some cases of Fijian journalists also being threatened as a result of their reporting on environmental issues and environmental impact. So it is, as I'm sure a lot of environmental journalists go through, it is fraught with some of these threats. But overall, reporting on climate change in the Pacific has elevated the issue of the true existential nature of the crisis on our islands.
Thank you. But no one was ever charged or arrested, or you're not got a sense of what happened?
No.
I've had this conversation with you, Cherelle, just in the last minutes about what journalists in the Pacific region need from the international community, and you said in a way we're very well trained. We now, I don't think you were when your paper was published in 2009, 2010, but I think in the intervening years there's been a lot of kind of training given. And yet you talk about your kind of office being burnt down, and you talk about not being seen in the room. So in that, not being recognized, having not your work seen in the international community, what do you say you need from the international community right now and from the international media houses right now?
Sure. There's a lot of, I think what Pacific journalists need, especially up and coming ones, is exposure. Mm-hmm. Exposure and opportunities to report on broader issues that include the Pacific from a global perspective. And I think this is the want and the need of every, developing country journalist, is to have the opportunity to report from the COP, to report from the convention meetings, to rub shoulders with experts in Oxford, to interview experts around the world. So what I feel the Pacific Island journalists need is access to expertise that could strengthen our stories, access to opportunities for coverage, whether that be meetings or events, but have some sort of resourcing that assists Pacific journalists. We are actually overtrained when it comes to climate journalism. That's partly my fault. So we've received on an annual basis something like 10, 15 trainings for the Pacific region on climate change and environmental reporting. Like you said, in 2010, when I was at Reuters, this wasn't so much the case. But since some of the work that we did, a lot of the attention came to the Pacific. Once Internews came into the Pacific, kind of like that was a game changer. And that required like 2 years of me harassing the Earth Journalism Network and telling them that we exist before they came and did training in the Pacific. And once they did, there was concerted effort by other agencies to also train Pacific journalists. So really what we need is exposure, access to expertise, and perhaps broadening the skill sets of Pacific journalists. Both in context, we have really small media industries and even smaller newsrooms. So opportunities for advancement within the industry is very, very limited. Like no one really makes it up to editor position because it's all owned by 4 or 5 people in one island, and it's just not an option. So having some opportunities for Pacific journalists to feature their work globally would be, in itself a really valuable opportunity. And of course, peer-to-peer learning and network with other like-minded journalists from around the world.
Thank you. And two questions, one very kind of practical one, which is from the audience, from Lauren Wedekind. What local organizations in Pacific, especially run by Pacific people, would you recommend that people follow and crucially donate to? This is kind of organizations focused on climate journalism and activism. You can also tell me later, we can send it around in our newsletter.
Sure. So we do have nationally focused national associations. So if you want to support Tonga, there is National Association of Journalists in Tonga or Fiji. It's usually best to support the national associations because they know what the local journalists need. In Samoa, we have the Samoa Alliance of Media Practitioners for Development. And so that also includes like camera operators and producers. And the reason why it's good to invest in that type of organization is because it's cross-sectoral in nature. So we also train camera crew on how to take like the best footage when you're out in the field. So I would recommend that you do look at national associations. There are some regional organizations. But if you're from an organization that wants to support journalism in the Pacific region, reach out to Pacific journalists and see what they need, and then initiate trainings or information sharing sessions. There's so many opportunities.
Great, thank you. And then last question, I'm going to combine two questions from two of our journalist fellows, from Ton, who's a documentary maker from the Netherlands, and Meraj, who we've spoken to before, from India, about climate change reporting in your countries. Ton is saying, if I was going to come to the Pacific Islands next year and rang you up and said, what should I be reporting on? What do you want, story do you want to get out there? What would your answer be? And then Meraj just says, again, what aspects of how climate change is impacting Samoa, the region, is being missed by the Western media at the moment?
Sure. So first of all, if you come to Samoa, don't pack anything warm because you're going to be really hot. What should you report on? The greatest threat to our communities in terms of climate change is the impact on fisheries. So a lot of our communities depend on fisheries for our livelihoods and subsistence, and that is not really well covered. I would say you go out to a village, talk to the fisherman who hasn't been able to make a good catch for 2 years. Talk to him about how 10 years ago he was able to go out for 1 hour and get enough for the week, versus now where he has to go back every 3 hours to try and get a catch. So those are like the direct impacts that need better coverage. And also how women who rely on the ocean for their families also are impacted, and how that's impacting education and like the standard of living for children. So the second question, Mira, you've kind of answered it, which is what are the specific climate impacts in Samoa, and what aspects of these impacts have the Western media generally missed or glided over? Sure. So the frequency of cyclones is a major one for us in Samoa, and the impact of those cyclones on the national economy, but also on the livelihoods of people. So when a cyclone hits, it basically wipes out all of the bananas, and that takes a long time to come back. So people then have to find alternative food sources. So it's like food security is a major one, and a very interesting impact that I didn't realize until recently when I experienced it myself was landslides. Landslides are not really common in Samoa, and the recent cyclones have caused massive landslides across Samoa. So I think looking at what are some of the measures in place and what are some of the examples from other countries in dealing with landslides, and food security as a result of the more extreme weather events and frequent cyclones.
Thank you. there's a lot to unpick there, and we will continue this conversation. But Cherelle, it's been a real honor to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time, especially this incredibly busy week.
Well, thank you so much, Mira, and thank you so much to the fellows. I love that when you ask a question that you say the name of the country, and you've already mentioned like 7 different countries. And that's the beauty of the Institute, is the fact that you have these amazing journalists and experts from their own countries, you know, take part in this. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you. Thank you and goodbye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.